Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Unleashing DePIN Podcast. My name is Tyler. I am your host, and like always, I am very excited for our next guest. We're going to have a really great conversation. Before we get into things, I did want to share one quick announcement. Our team recently shared a new tool, public good, that we've built for the space. It is called DePIN Pulse. It is a tool for helping people find DePIN earning opportunities from hardware to other activities, lending and staking. So we did drop an announcement on our Twitter, which I will link below. So please check it out. It does help support all the efforts that we're doing at the podcast, and we really appreciate it. So with that, I am incredibly excited to have our next guest, Jon. He is the co-founder and CEO of Beamable. Jon, welcome to the podcast.
Awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we met not too long ago at Consensus at an event. And it's kind of funny, whenever you go to these conferences, you're never really sure who you're going to meet. You sort of bump in and chit chat with a bunch of people. And you and I, within like 2 minutes, started diving in on some really kind of fun topics, both DePIN and what you're doing and kind of your history and your career. And it was quite exciting. You're very much an industry and expert in what you're doing and what you're building. So I figured this would be an awesome chance to have a cool conversation about that. So before we kick into things, can you share with the audience a little bit about who you are, kind of what your background is, and what you're doing in the space?
Yeah, I'll do that. So I spent a lot of my life as a game developer. And as people will learn, we're addressing problems of game infrastructure, and we can come back to that. I can hopefully help people understand a little bit more what it's like to be a game developer and some of the challenges there, because it's hard to be a game developer. But almost everyone's a gamer these days, so I'm hoping people can relate to it. But I spent most of my life as a game developer. I actually met my future wife in an online game called Gemstone back in the era of text-based online games, and met her, decided to drop out of college and start a game studio with her, and we started an online game called Legends of Future Past. So I cut my teeth on that. And then after running that for a number of years, I've done stuff in technology as well. So I started a website technology company, helping people make websites with a automation platform called ePrize. I've been on the data side of the industry, so started a company called Gamer DNA that looked at all the achievements people were earning on Xbox, which you can use to understand more about how people play games and what kind of games they like, recommend other games that they might enjoy. And then went back to making games again. So spent about a decade at Disruptor Beam, a studio I started to try to bring story-based games to the world of web browser-based and mobile games, where not a lot of story was happening. There was a lot of mindless clicking at the time. And we discovered the way to do that was through really popular Hollywood IP. So built a Game of Thrones game, met George R. R. Martin, worked with HBO, did a Walking Dead game, did a Star Trek game, did a Archer game based on the FX animated series. So built all those games, shipped games to 20 million people, learned a lot about what can go right. Saw some stuff not go right too, because you can't succeed 100% of the time in games. But did manage to build some great products. Star Trek Timelines, you can pick that up, play that today on your mobile device if you're a Star Trek fan. But 4 years ago, decided that I had this unique set of experiences in games. So I'd built games, I'd lived the life of a game developer, saw all these things that could go right or wrong, and saw how much complexity there was in dealing with infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning like all the game servers, the social systems, the online economies. And we had actually built one of the first blockchain-based games too. So we took our Star Trek Timelines game and we worked with Forte back in the day to build a blockchain-enabled game, minted 1 million wallets on their chain. So we got super early insight into like building in that whole world. And I just saw so much complexity there. And here's the bottom line with game developers. I think one of the core things to be successful in games is shots on goal, meaning try a lot of things, not just different games, but things within your games. How do you get most shots on goal? Well, it's all about your development velocity. If you're spending your time wrestling with technology and setting up servers, load balancers, hyperscalers, building and connecting backend systems with middleware, all of those things, frankly, they're a waste of time, more than a waste of time. They impede your ability as a game developer to do the stuff that matters, which is deliver fun experiences. So I felt like the more I could help with that part, the more we could make game developers successful. They'd keep more of the economics to themselves. They would try more things. They get more shots on goal. So I wanted to do that. So 4 years ago, I decided to stop making these licensed Hollywood games for a variety of reasons. Also, I didn't think that was as good a business model anymore at that point in time. And I felt like I could help thousands of people make games instead of just one game after another for myself. But that's what I've been doing now for the last 4 years at Beamable. And today we've got a whole bunch of games launched on the platform, 56 shipped games so far, over 100 that are in active development. And it's both like what we call Web3 as well as Web2. So we have some of the biggest Web3 publishers on the platform. So companies like Mythical Games and Wildcard Alliance, Mystery Society, but also those Web2 games as well, like Star Trek, not the blockchain version, but just, normal free-to-play gaming on mobile and, lots of games like that actually generate a ton of traffic. And actually, when we get into DePIN, that's sort of the interesting piece of this is like, that's actually a really important thing for a DePIN network is to have that, that existing demand side, which frankly, it comes from the Web2 world in gaming today more than the Web3, although we all hope that will change over the coming years.
Yeah, I continue to be a strong believer that DePIN will be sort of the wedge, if you will, that gets that Web2 adoption, because as I'm sure we're going to talk about on this episode, it solves a lot of unique problems that aren't really addressed in sort of the legacy centralized space. But I want to take it back to sort of your previous experience. And part of the reason why I found chatting with you super interesting is because, you really have done this at the highest level. You ship games that have been used by millions and millions of people, some of those AAA titles that you talked about. You shared a few of those kind of pain points and key learnings, but when it comes to building games generally, whether it's for, Game of Thrones or whether it's just an independent game that an individual developer is trying to create, what is sort of that process like? Like, what is the building sort of timeline, if you will, look like for those who maybe this is kind of a new concept for game development?
Game development it's kind of a mess. That's the reality of it. So I think you're used to seeing the finished product as a game player, but it's a crazy journey to go through this because you've got two things that you're grappling with, at least two things. It's actually a lot more than that, but the two big areas are you're creating a entertainment product, so it has to be fun and engaging, and that's full of risks and just hard to do. But it's entertainment embodied in technology. So all of the technology also has all of these risks in it. So it's like when you build a game, you take on all the risks of all these different things, you put them together. And that's why in the game industry, number one, the vast majority of games that begin development never even ship. And you don't even really hear about these things. Maybe you'll go to like Steam and you'll notice all of the early access games that never actually ship or previews that never actually ship. Like those are actually pretty far along. There's a ton of games that just kind of, they start developing it and then they get canceled. The funding runs out. They weren't able to make enough progress. So it just doesn't continue. Even if you make it through all of that and you ship a game, it's an industry where like, if you're lucky, maybe 1 out of 5 games is profitable, meaning it returns the capital that was originally invested in it, then some. So it's just an incredibly high risk industry. I come back to my shots on goal aspect, which is you have to increase your velocity and try a lot of things. And sometimes with a game concept, that could even include radically different ideas along the way. With our own game, Star Trek Timelines, I think is a really good example of that. Star Trek Timelines, we built about 5 different versions of that game and we tried them in-house, and the first 4 just were not fun enough. We probably could have finished the game in any one of them and it would have been just okay kind of thing, but it wouldn't have been a great game. We really aspired to deliver this experience that had Gene Roddenberry's vision in it, this optimistic future where it's about storytelling, but also almost this fantasy sports aspect. If you try our Star Trek Timelines game that I built, you kind of put your crew together, your dream team crew. So it's kind of like fantasy sports. Like, here's my dream team that I would put together if I could. So in this game, you send away teams off to different planets. So we wanted to kind of combine those elements, the optimistic, the storytelling aspect. Like Star Trek isn't just about violence. It has violence, but it's also just a lot about like exploring worlds and technology and science, philosophy, ethics, all of that stuff. And then how do these different characters that you can combine into these teams work within that context? How do they work together? How do they solve story problems differently? So we wanted to bring that to life. And beyond just sort of the fun factor in those first 4 versions of the game, it wasn't bringing that to life. And it was only after a lot of just hammering away and a lot of frustration, frankly, that we eventually got to a 5th version that we liked. And it took us like a year to get to that. So for people that are thinking about games, and this comes up on the investment side all the time, it's like, I just really encourage anyone who thinks about backing a game, and that goes for crypto, backing it on a Kickstarter, VCs who want to fund it. I don't know, maybe this is financial. Everyone always disclaims finance. This is financial advice. Like, give that team runway, right? Like that could potentially make some difference there, because like they're going to make a lot of mistakes, and give them the space to make mistakes and even reboot the idea. That's really important. So yeah, game development, it's a real mess. It's a real mess. It's probably one of the most risky things that you could ever consider getting involved in. And if you love games and you can't imagine yourself doing anything else but being part of this crazy industry, then it's almost like a mental disease where we are just forced to do it because of who we are. But it's not a sane thing to do. It's not rational to be building these products because of how hard they are.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure that your kind of pain points or personal scars has been a real, catalyst for what you're trying to build, or what you are building, I should say, at Beamable. You talked about enabling shots on goals. Can you kind of talk through maybe some of those catalyst moments that were really a driver for getting you to build what you're building at Beamable? And then for folks who are maybe unfamiliar with it, kind of give a high level overview about what Beamable is, and then we can start talking about some of the DePIN aspects there too.
Yeah. So when you're building a live services game, so a live services game is really any game with an online component. So there's a part that runs on your computer and there's a part that runs on the cloud. The part that runs on your computer is mostly the graphics system of that game. So there are 2 major tools that are used today to create that graphics front end. One is called Unity, which is now a public company, and the other is Unreal Engine, which is from Epic Games. And most people know about Epic Games from Fortnite, which is, world-beating success. So those are the 2 3D engines that people tend to use. But the thing about those technologies is that they're almost entirely just the software that runs and delivers graphics and animation and physics and user interface, all of that stuff on the front end. But if you're playing an online game that has multi-user systems, social systems, online economies, game rules that have to be adjudicated up in the cloud because you can't really trust individual game clients to not cheat, like all of that stuff requires cloud-based technology. And today in the game industry, there's an enormous amount of dollars being spent on all facets of that, on the order of tens of billions of dollars. So from the consumer standpoint, it's about $200 billion a year of software. If you want to include like console sales, hardware, et cetera, it's like a $300 billion plus industry every year. So huge on the consumer side, but like within that, one of the biggest cost centers for games is all of this cloud-based infrastructure. And live services, which is what in the industry we would call the business model of having connected entertainment, social systems, and online economies and stuff, that is huge percentage of the industry's revenue. Why? Because it's sustainable. It gives game companies incentives to continue to add things to it. It creates communities where people are socially connected with each other. It's just what works. It doesn't mean there aren't like super fun single player games. Like I play single player games too. There's nothing against those games. They're awesome. But from a revenue standpoint, from what's sustainable inside the industry, live services is what's keeping so many game studios in business today. All right. So that's that's the business model side of it. To do a live services game, you have to invest in a lot of technology. So historically, companies had to build all of that themselves. So if you look at some of the older studios that exist today, like if you play World of Warcraft, Blizzard, for example, like they had to invent all of this stuff. They had to do everything from server hosting up through the software stack. They basically just invented virtually everything from the ground up to support the live operations of the game. And that has continued really for many, many years, up until fairly recently. There were not a lot of options to build on infrastructure that already existed. You kind of just had to invent it. So that costs a lot of money. There's one research study out there from a company, actually the competitor of ours, but we're very friendly, called Metaplay. They did some really smart research, I think. They found it would cost like $22 million on average to have a game studio or a game publisher actually develop their whole live services infrastructure. I think for at scale, like the World of Warcraft scale, clearly much more than that. Like add another zero on the end at least, and you kind of have an idea of what that costs. So very capital intensive. Looks like it's about 20% of the budgets of a lot of game companies when they're actually operating. Yeah, and it can vary. Like if you're a world-beating success, maybe that number shrinks and it kind of no one cares about it anymore. But for the vast majority of studios, like it's a really huge cost center that sucks up a lot of dollars. But it's not just dollars, it's the risk. Okay. And this is going to lead into the DePIN stuff in a moment, because really what I feel our mission is in this business is removing risk from the equation for game developers. So number one, having a software stack that people can use that they know works, that other game studios have deployed on, that has supported high amounts of traffic, but also just the workflow works. Like I was a game developer. I know what you do on a day in, day out basis inside a game studio. And game developers sit in front of Unity and Unreal and build around that. And anytime you add a whole bunch of extra screens and extra IDEs, more programming languages, middleware to develop, DevOps systems that you have to kind of wrap around everything, like all of that takes away from it, adds complexity, slows down that velocity, reduces shots on goal. So we want to keep it really simple, like the workflow that game developers know in the languages that they know, one debug environment, one deployment process. So that's the software aspect that we reduced risk from, so that they don't have to build these things and they can scale up their cost according to actually being used. Like as their game becomes popular, they're paying more in the rollout as opposed to funding all of this stuff and absorbing a lot of time in the development process of the game. And then when they are shipping and they move into what we call the live operations stage of the game, the technology is already there. It's ready to scale up. It gives them the analytics, support, decision-making. It's just there to help them now grow as a business. So that's the fundamental software. On the DePIN side, here's the bottom line for a lot of game studios. They all really worry about whether the choice. So if they build it themselves, they've made a decision that's like really expensive. I hope they don't want to build it themselves. Some of the ones that will do it because they're worried about the risk of choosing someone. For the people that are going to like quote unquote buy an off-the-shelf solution, one of the main things they will worry about is, how can I be assured that my selection of someone else's technology is going to stick around? And frankly, they have a lot of reasons to worry about that. In the case of a product called GameSparks, which was acquired by Amazon, they decided to shut it down after a few years, and thousands of games were shut down as a result of that. In other cases, like, Microsoft has a product called PlayFab. It works okay. Like a lot of people use it. It's like a kind of a default option in the industry, but they haven't really updated the roadmap in quite some time. So it's sort of a little bit static from a development perspective, and they've kind of tried to push people towards Azure, their cloud hosting platform, and people discovered that then when you do custom stuff there, it gets very, very expensive very fast. So people are really worried about the risks around continuity, business model changes, and things like that. And it's just one of these I just always had this vision of decentralizing our platform. We kind of got started thinking like, could we build the decentralized Roblox, so to speak? Like, unlike one quote unquote metaverse where you build inside their sandbox with their tools and their control over the economy and their 70-80% take rate? Like, is there a way to open that up and you use Unity or Unreal and there's a protocol underneath that supports all the things you want to do? That was sort of the original vision and one that we still have. But the path to get there is got to go through how do you create these foundational kind of infrastructure technologies to support, starting with the larger developers who just need to get out there with sustainable infrastructure in a way where we know that there's a network of hundreds, if not thousands, of stakeholders in the form of node operators where they're invested in the success of the network. You have people contributing code and adding to the ecosystem with components that add more back-end and game logic capabilities that you can draw upon. Let's make them stakeholders in this as well so that they can participate in the upside of the network. Really think of this more as an ecosystem that will have sustainability. And the reason DePIN is the exact solution for that, it's just kind of the aha moment we had when it's like, all right, first you got to remove risk, meaning you have to be able to take these nodes that offer the software, make it available to anyone who wants to operate it. And then how do you actually then have the value exchange between the consumers of that computation, which is going to be the game studios, packaged into a format and SDKs that make it readily accessible to them. But how do you do the value exchange with the people who are now going to provide the compute supply? And how do you incentivize the build out of that network over time on the supply side? And how do you also supply enough demand out of the gate, which, that comes back to one of my earlier comments, like Web 2 developers. By the way, no game developer in Web 2 calls himself a Web 2 game developer. They call themselves game developers. Right. That's a term that we in blockchain kind of use, but
right.
They have the demand right now. Like, they're the ones who actually need servers to stand up and support all that. So like, you just put all that together, and DePIN is such an elegant solution for this. Why? Because now you're onboarding game developers. We're using all the crypto language here, but we'll keep using it for now. You're onboarding game developers into Web3, but for their infrastructure, not convincing them that they have to have a different kind of game design. You don't have to convince them that an open trading economy for their game is what's going to make sense, because frankly, there's plenty of games out there where you don't need that. Right. And why tell them that that's the only solution? I happen to think there's great games within open trading economies. I've been talking about this on my blogs and videos for literally years now. But it's going to be a segment of the market, not the entire market. And all of these other game types that are going to continue to get made, there's an opportunity here for the compute capacity to be supplied to them in a way that's very standardized, that they know it's going to continue to be around. They don't have to worry about a centralized provider making a change to a business model or their roadmap, or just straight up canceling the platform, because they know it's going to be around. And by the way, at the same time, it's a lower cost because there's a lot of margin built into the hyperscalers, which is where most of these products end up being deployed. There's a lot of enterprise grade compute capacity out there in a range of suppliers that provide a really great foundation for this network for even AAA kind of game experiences.
Sure. Yeah, and that was one of the first things that really piqued my interest about how you're approaching using the DePIN model. There's a lot of projects out there that it's kind of this catchy buzzword right now. We were in the space before people were even calling it DePIN, but the reality is the problem set that you're really focused on, which was somewhat new to me, is that, okay, you need to provide sort of these core foundational components, but really one of the other big problems that you've seen so many game developers sort of fall by the wayside as a result of is because the providers themselves go out of business, they get acquired. And that's one of the really beautiful things about DePIN. There's so many examples. Helium probably is one of the best examples for folks who maybe don't know. Doing this kind of crypto coordinated model was a bit of a Hail Mary for them to save the project. And now we see how ubiquitous like the LoRaWAN adoption has been and the sustainability. I've had countless projects on the podcast. One comes to mind called Wingbits, where it was a very similar thing. They provide flight tracking, which initially was sort of this decentralized thing where one core service provider aggregated the data. That company got acquired by some private equity fund, and as a result of it, they sort of stripped the incentives for people to participate, and everybody went off the network. But when you decentralize it and everybody as a stakeholder is incentivized to continue sort of proclamating the network and sustaining it, you remove that risk. And so it's such an elegant way to use this model and solve the other half of the problem, which is the sort of sustainability, if you will. Are there other aspects to, and you talked a little bit about them, like from the compute side and a few of the other angles there, but are there other benefits, if you will, that sort of this DePIN decentralized infrastructure model brings to your core kind of product offering for game builders that you're able to unpack a little bit further?
Well, one aspect I'd love to double click on a little bit is the ecosystem we also want to build around software. So compute is one aspect of it, but there's an opportunity here to actually foster a software ecosystem around what we call the back-end components of games. So I'll return to the DePIN aspect of that in a moment, but let's talk about it from the front end by analogy first. So we talked a little bit about how there are 3D engines like Unity and Unreal Engine, which people use on the front end of making the graphics and the systems of their game. One of the reasons why both of those products are so powerful in the market, and it's not like they don't have competitors trying to chip away. There's some really great teams like Godot and whatnot, or examples of like people that may have a chance to kind of chip into that. But they've got these vast ecosystems of contributors that add plugin components, visual assets, all kinds of interoperability with a lot of other software systems. And that ecosystem investment has made them, I won't say unassailable, but very hard to assail. So their platforms are very strong today because off the shelf, you have so many options that you've got. And it's essentially this built-in network effect where every time someone uploads something to what we call the Unity Asset Store is like this library of all kinds of content and software components that you can add to your game. Every time someone adds something to that, they just added value to the entire ecosystem of Unity developers. Same thing. Unreal has a marketplace that serves the same purpose. And likewise, like if you run into a developer that has benefited from a particular software plugin and they're like, oh, I made that for Unity, like now you have another reason to go to Unity and use it as your 3D engine, or Unreal as your 3D engine. So that's happening on the front end. That really doesn't exist on the back end for games. There's stuff like database servers and things like that, the fundamental components, which problem there is you shouldn't actually be having to think about a lot of databases and stuff like that when you're building up your game. It should just sort of work for you automatically in the way that, say, Roblox provides a lot of this capability for you. I mean, Roblox is a game environment, to be clear. It's just sort of accessing more of a long tail of game developers, and much more of the environment is fully integrated. But there isn't really a back-end ecosystem for games because things don't really talk to each other. There's really no standardization, no data fabric for things to communicate with each other and exchange information about important parts of the gameplay experience from module to module. And that's what we actually hope to change as well with our DePIN project, because compute is one aspect. All these game studios need compute, but they need that compute to do readily off-the-shelf things. And that's where the software layer that we wrap around it becomes so valuable, because we make it easy to actually adopt. I feel like this is the number one thing that most game developers in Web3, by the way, often overlook at the start of their project, which is they underestimate just how much technical integration work they're signing up for. So we are trying to create a software layer around that addresses those workflow concerns. So much more of it is automated and a push a button in your 3D engine and it stands up capability for you. But when we have this DePIN network that is oriented around a set of those standards and the standard data fabric, what you're really saying is now start implementing software modules that compose into the network, where I'll give you a very specific example. Like, let's say you have a better matchmaking algorithm for your game. So matchmaking is something that a lot of games have to do. You need to make sure that the right players are playing with each other. Well, guess what? Matchmaking is actually very complicated. There's lots of different matchmaking algorithms. It varies according to different kind of games. It may need to tap into specific kinds of data, like tournament systems, match records, ELO scores. Like, we could have a talk for an hour on matchmaking systems, but that's just like one example. And if you make a particular matchmaking system that's good for specific use cases within gaming, we think that you should be able to contribute that code. Anybody should be able to use it, and you should be able to get essentially a share of the earnings potential of that, which is your code running on servers. So if your code, your module for matchmaking in this example, is running on a bunch of servers up on the DePIN network, we think it's going to be important to have some part of the economics come back to you as the developer. And right now, there's really no model for that. You'd either have to go full SaaS and become a SaaS developer with an API in the cloud, in which case you still have all these problems of like integration, interoperability, and you're back to the world of game developers having to create middleware. And maybe you go away, like all the issues come back. So we want to solve that once and for all. Have the ecosystem, have the compute architecture there, where game developers can just go back to building great games, not worry about this stuff so much, and focus on the fun, because that's what we need here.
Yeah, I mean, that's the most important component to all of this for long-term success and viability, I would imagine. And as you break down the the aspects of what is sort of part of the DePIN role, if you will, you talked about compute. Are there other parts of that stack, if you will, such as like decentralized storage or decentralized graphics or GPUs that sort of play a role, or that you envision playing a role in that stack for what you're building?
I think we're going to partner with people around some of that. Like, we can't boil the ocean and do all things. That in some ways is against the ethos of Web3 too. Like, then you're just becoming a hyperscaler like AWS, except wrapped in blockchain, and you're attempting to do absolutely everything. That's not actually our goal. Like, we know what we're really good at. We know that there's tens of billions of being spent just on like CPU-based game-specific computation, which has all these wacky requirements in terms of how the tech stack works, how it works with 3D engines. The statefulness of an experience is just very different than transactional database applications. So there's a lot that's different about it. So, for example, like, I think another interesting domain within DePIN that's relevant to gaming is what's happening around GPU-based stuff. Like Aether, I think, is doing very interesting work there. But, you could look at a couple of the major applications of GPU is like cloud streaming and then AI execution up in the cloud on GPUs. So we see that being very complementary to us. In fact, what we would prefer to do is work with a range of partners like that, because there's a future not too far down the road, maybe only a couple of years away, where actually what you'll be able to get to is build your game in Unity, the cloud server aspect that processes the rules of your game and the logic and tournament systems, matchmaking, all of these online components. That's just sort of there on tap in a standard protocol-based method that you can just use from your game. Then you have a whole other problem that happens, which is you have to distribute your game. So then you have a couple of choices. One choice today is you publish it, you upload it to Steam, you're in business, they distribute the game for you. Steam's super good at it. That's why they're very dominant in the market today. But there might be other ways. What if we could just upload this to the cloud and it streams the game for you? Well, that's where something like an Aether gets really interesting, because they and a couple of other really notable DePIN projects can help solve that. So now you've got a game in the cloud. What if we get to the point where you're just sitting in front of Unity, all the server-based stuff is there. At the end of the process, when you're ready to deploy, you're not just deploying the server modules and still having to ship your game, the whole shipping aspect is also handled for you. So this is going to these are aspects that will take some time, but that's kind of how we see the future playing out, which is there's going to be a few really scaled out DePIN use cases that are relevant to games that are going to work collectively together. We're going to be focusing on the back end live services infrastructure and then working with some other partners, because I think we have to be realistic. Like the DePIN, the compute stack, like all the things that you need to do for that, like it's very different to deliver GPU workloads than all the stuff I've been talking about with respect to Beamable's DePIN network. But you can make those things work side by side very elegantly. And some of it just kind of comes down to how you create the software tooling and workflow around it, and the automation that kind of happens at the same time, the over-the-wire content updates and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, certainly partnering with some of those synergistic companies, I think would make a lot of sense. Really, the core value prop that DePIN is bringing to Beamable is sort of both the ecosystem and call it the longevity and sustainability of sort of the platform and what you're delivering for game developers. One of the other interesting things about DePIN that I wanted to pick your brain on a little bit is that it can also help drive out inefficiencies and sort of reduce cost. Are you looking at how DePIN will also help these game developers maybe scale in a more economical or sort of affordable way that helps drive some of these costs that maybe centralized providers are really scalping their customers from? And are you thinking about how DePIN can sort of enable some of those benefits as well for developers in the future here?
Yeah, we are, because the scale out of just like your game's ability to have a certain number of users on it is an expensive part of games. Games can be very bursty. Like you can suddenly have a big announcement and you have a huge herd of people who want to come in and play the game. And that's kind of the business case for hyperscalers right now, which is Amazon's got millions of servers sitting around, not just Amazon, but all the hyperscalers have millions of servers sitting around that can absorb that traffic, and you can use it, and you don't need to be sitting on those machines. You can invoke them, but that comes with a lot of cost associated with it. I think the early evidence from some of the other DePIN projects that have already happened, like I don't think I even necessarily need to prove this on a Beamable specific thesis. Like if you look at Aether, again, I'll point to them again because I think they've done quite a good job of like thinking through like network design and who they brought in as supply providers and whatnot. They've shown that like the cost of doing it through DePIN using underutilized server capacity at game publishers, bare metal hosting providers, things like that, and then aggregating it together gets you to economics that are at least half relative to what a hyperscaler has. Hyperscalers, by the way, can still bid on network traffic too, or they can ask for network traffic too. So like, let's apply a little pricing pressure to them. Like they can throw their servers at it and run nodes just like anybody else, but it just won't be matched through the quality of service and pricing algorithms that our router network will help provide if they're in that equation. So I think it's perfectly fine for like, I've said some negative things about Amazon, but actually Amazon, to be honest, like they've been a great partner to Beamable as we've grown. Like they've provided the infrastructure, but it has also just shown us sort of the opportunities for improvement on a global basis. And Amazon, Azure, GCP, like they can still be part of the equation. They're still going to have millions of servers, and they can add capacity too. But overall, the net effect of it is that the consumers, which are games, are going to benefit from a much lower cost.
Right. Yeah. And you love that the DePIN model sort of has all these built-in value props that are delivered. And, it's really clear what the primary focus is, but those long tail benefits are also really important to people that are in the building space and those that are actually creating these really awesome games that we get to use on a day-to-day basis. Beamable has been in development for a while. You have a lot that's up and running. You have a lot of customers. Where are you at in your product journey? And then specifically, where is the kind of the DePIN part of the story at as part of that arch from a product development standpoint? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, the whole history of the tech stack at Beamable is it got started back at Disruptor Beam, the game studio that I ran for years. And the first engineer that I hired there was Ali El Ramol, and he's our CTO now. And he was brought in as my first engineer, and he became the whole architect of the internal platform that we used back at Disruptor Beam. So that happened many years ago. The reality of it is every game studio makes a lot of technology that isn't exactly portable outside of their own environment because it has so many internalized dependencies and document all these things. But so we had to we had a lot of investment in it, and it did a lot, but we then needed to do a whole effort to productize it. So in 2020, we had terrible timing, by the way. Like nobody knew the pandemic was coming. But we had this plan coming into 2020 that, okay, this is the year we're going to pivot over from game making to game technology. And the pandemic happened, and frankly, it was a complete mess. We suddenly were in a super bind financially. No investors wanted to look at anything. Like no one was going to support anything. So we had to go through like a whole, but we were determined to do it. So we went through a whole messy reorg, got through the process, got to the other side of it, eventually did find investors who I guess admired the fighting spirit of the team to kind of just be stubborn enough to go through that. And having done that reorg, we then took the next couple of years to take that technology and do a serious R&D effort to repackage it and structure it in a way that could be brought to people as a product rather than just a bunch of lines of code that people would have to sort out. That's a big effort. So fortunately, I built technology products before at other companies. Like I mentioned earlier, I did ePrize, I did Gamer DNA. So I had a lot of appreciation for how hard that was going to be. So we took it seriously, did it, and we got to a point where now a couple of years ago, again, timing wasn't the great. We've never had great timing in this business, but in middle of 22, when the bear set in and we were starting to really sign up customers and Web3 people were starting to jump on the platform because we were starting to make it easy. We just launched. We had to just be super disciplined from there. We've managed to we brought more capital into the company. We kept it going. Today, we've spent a lot of capital on building this product. I mentioned the $22 million on average that game studios tend to spend on building this kind of infrastructure. Not, strikingly close to I think what our numbers would be if we really dug deep into our books. So there's a lot of effort that has to go into building this stuff. So it's not easy to get to. The next stage of our journey was, we started this as a SaaS product, a kind of a cloud-based API that you could access for this with web browser interfaces and stuff. And that has just been like a very consistently growing business for us. But we were hearing from bigger studios this idea of risk. And a lot of them were telling us, we love your tech stack. The workflow is perfect. Like, this is exactly what we need. But how do we know that if we select this, we're not in trouble if the worst happens to Beamable? So we realized at that point in time, we had to start decentralizing the technology. And the first way we approached that is what I would call just like the decentralized Web 2 version of the product. So we had to take the SaaS product, restructure it in a way that it could be deployed on people's infrastructure so that they could run it themselves. And that was a huge effort to package it that way, because SaaS products are kind of built, generally speaking, without having to worry about that. So you can cut certain corners and you just worry about different things when you're building SaaS. So we had to rethink a lot of the architecture. We increasingly built it around this idea of microservices as sort of the core code execution module within Beamable. So that was sort of where we went next. And about a little over a year ago at the Game Developers Conference last year, we launched what we call the private cloud version of that product, which is the decentralized Web 2 version of the product. But we always had this idea, like I said, from the outset, it's like, how can we build decentralized Roblox? How can you make a development tool stack that people could build whatever they want anywhere, not have to worry about the sustainability of the dependencies? And the answer was obvious. We had to create a more of a blockchain-enabled way to take this technology stack and bring it to everybody in that sustainable way. And, DePIN was sort of a semi-new term at the time, but like the idea of decentralized compute wasn't entirely new just because we have a new label for this stuff. So we were already kind of thinking along those lines, but it's just such an elegant solution to the problem, because in my mind, it's really one of the great use cases of blockchain technology, because on the one hand, you have off-chain compute. Like that's what DePIN really is. It's like off-chain compute, but it's a resource. It's a super valuable resource that needs to be matched to the consumers of that resource. But now how do we remove the centralized providers who can do all that stuff we talked about earlier that was a negative, who could shut it down, who could just decide to go out of business, who could sell it to private equity that squeeze every last dime out of it and then take all the incentives out of the ecosystem. We knew that we had to solve for that. And with blockchain, and you solve that because you have value exchange between the parties involved without that intermediary. Everything is done at a protocol level. And I think it's, short of just sort of the basics of like exchanging value directly anyway, like payments going back to Bitcoin or just pure store of value, like this is what this technology really exists for. Like, how do you take compute resources, distribute them, and then create a system of incentives to allow suppliers and consumers of computational resources to be matched with each other and do that exchange without rent takers in the middle doing all that nasty stuff.
Yeah. No, I'm certainly sold on that value prop without question. You shared that about a year ago you had your sort of private cloud deployment of showing off how this more decentralized approach can work out in the wild. What is the sort of expected timeline for when users, individual contributors can start becoming nodes on the network? Is that something that is kind of a public figure? Is this...
It's like we have more work to do, and we just want to be realistic. I think there's so much aspiration in blockchain land that like stuff gets overhyped. I know, for better or for worse, I'm like the opposite of that. I try to just be pragmatic, and I'll share what our vision is. But we're going to be sharing a lot more things about that. I posted an article on my blog just earlier this week that kind of laid out the vision for what we want to do, and it was very well received, very widely circulated, actually. But now everyone's asking for more details. So fine, we're going to share more details. We'll roll out, white papers and all that kind of stuff in the coming weeks so that people can learn more about it. The exact timeline for nodes, or even like the structure of how we're going to make nodes available and tokens and stuff like that. Like, we have a lot of work to do on that before we're ready to talk about it. But I would just say, like, follow Beamable on X, follow my Substack. You'll learn what you need to know as this stuff comes out.
Yeah, well, and we'll be sure to link all of that for people to stay updated and whatnot. And I'll press you on one more little point, see if I can squeeze it out of you. Do you foresee a vision or a future where you'll have dedicated hardware nodes that people will deploy? Will you sort of leverage existing, like, people can run this on their computer to become a node operator in the ecosystem? At a very high level, you don't have to commit us to any sort of specifics here, but how are you sort of envisioning that hardware aspect to the decentralized infrastructure playing a role in what you're gonna ship soon?
I mean, so it's a great question. So we have different kinds of node types in our architecture design. So first of all, I can't tell you the exact date, but in terms of the order of operations, we're going to have validator nodes before we have any other kind of nodes available for people to use. And that's just because you need the validation network to ensure the integrity of the network and the fairness of the network, and you don't have cheaters and all that stuff. So that will get booted up first. The validator nodes there will be a spec that's required for that, but validator nodes can kind of run anywhere, right? Where it gets more complicated is the computational nodes where the workloads are actually processed. So In our case, we call those container nodes, and they're containers because basically they're just big containers for running any arbitrary number of microservices. They're multi-tenanted microservice delivery machines that happen to be geared towards the specific use cases of games. They're great at executing C#, all of that stuff. We want to be like pragmatic about that. Like, I don't think that's something where you're going to see right out of the gate, like you can run a container on your phone or something, and like a AAA game is bouncing server code off of people's phones on an edge network near you. I think eventually there could be nodes like that add compute, and for certain kinds of games, that might be an acceptable quality of service. And we are actually building a lot of tech into our network where node goes down, it can be rerouted and reestablished elsewhere. So it's not like the phone that goes away in that scenario means the game dies and you have nothing. It'll just find someone else. That said, that's a tricky quality of service issue. It's a tricky security issue. It's tricky from a cheating standpoint. So there's a lot of issues when you open up the compute. So we want to be thoughtful about how we build out that part of the network. So in the earlier days of it, we're going to really be focused on enterprise grade providers of compute where we know it's locked down, it's at trustable game publishers, bare metal service providers, et cetera. And that's going to be the initial suppliers of the container nodes in the network. And frankly, that's just so important because we got to start from a position. Again, this is a trust business. We need to start from a position of trust. There's going to be tricky security problems to solve. Our long-term roadmap will think through, like, how do you add more and more node operators that might operate on lower grade machines? And then how do we pair that compute with a different kind of game or games that don't care, or maybe they're just games that need, a lower price to fit their business models for whatever reason. So we want to make that available, but as you make it more available, you also introduce all those tricky problems around everything: performance, quality, latency, security. And we want to be just like really thoughtful about the rollout process for that. So I don't know over what timeline that's going to take, more than a year. It's like more than a couple of years, most likely. But that's how you have to build these networks out. And we think there's some great suppliers of compute that are excited about participating in the supply side of kind of the enterprise grade kind of boot up stage of the network.
Sure. Well, I think that being pragmatic about your rollout approach is both important, and it also sort of ensures that the value you're trying to derive, or that you will derive from what DePIN can enable, isn't like an undermining factor by doing something too quickly and it's sort of half baked. And so I think everybody, all stakeholders, will be appreciative of that.
Just to inject it, like the other part that people I think always gloss over in a lot of the more aspirational DePIN projects is also just the demand side. So one advantage Beamable has in trying to build this is we have built-in demand already. There's games on the platform, and frankly, the vast majority of them don't really care where the compute happens as long as it's at the quality of service that they're used to. So we're going to be able to start shifting demand from our own internalized operations to the newer suppliers that are operating off the DePIN network out of the gate. And also, Web 2 really fuels the earliest stages, maybe the forever stages, but certainly in the early days of this, Web 3 games, which might be the most blockchain native, like, I think they're excited about this because it's so philosophically aligned. But from a traffic perspective, it's really hard to know when the true Web3 hits are going to arrive, or even if they're going to arrive, depending on who you ask. So our business is not dependent on when that happens, even though we all hope it happens. We're much more focused on this redeployment of the very well-established Web 2 demand side that we already have as a company. Most of our demand that we can initially deploy in the network will be Web 2. And that's also where the immediate growth will come as people kind of hunt for more options to provide game servers for their games.
Yeah. Does part of that sort of Web 2 driven demand. Are you guys satisfying that or helping sort of serve that market by interoperating and sort of supporting things like Unity and Unreal and like making it a really seamless process from the development side to sort of the deployment and post game management side? Is that part of the Beamable product stack, if you will?
Yeah, that's our workflow system. You could call it our SDK, but maybe calling it an SDK is a little almost trivializes the extent of the capability. I mean, it includes tooling that you can use within your Unity editor environment, your Unreal Studio environment, where you're adding online capabilities visually for the most part in your game or through simple form-based interfaces. And when you need to stand up your own custom code microservices or your own specific backend logic, that's pretty much a push a button type thing from Unity or from an Unreal. Like you write your code side by side with your front end code. You've got observability up and down the stack. You've got debugging up and down the stack, meaning, for example, you could set a breakpoint on your back end code, initiate that logic from your front end code, and from your developer machine, see it go up and down the stack. In fact, here's a cool thing about it. Like the whole distributed architecture that we've created that is going to power this node network, we've already built, the vast majority of this tech stack in that when you are a developer using Beamable, you're actually running a version of that node. We don't really call it a node on your local machine, but like you're already running those microservices locally using technology called Docker containers. And what essentially happens is the custom code, you're not even having to go to a remote server. Like you're already running that server code like resident with your client code on your developer workstation. So we've already got this vast sort of distributed compute environment where these code modules can either live in the cloud, on a given machine, on an edge node, on your own developer workstation. So getting it to the point of that seamless experience, that seamless workflow does require everything from user interface work to just respecting the languages, the debugging techniques, the deployment processes, the scheduling of updates. Like a lot of games are built around things like over-the-wire updates where it's not just code updates, it's code along with content changes, new graphics files, new rules, an event that's going to happen where people get bonuses for playing the game in a particular period. Like all that stuff has to be packaged up, shipped simultaneously. And you also have to have the ability to roll that back again. So like a lot of logic around that is inherent in our SDK and our workflow systems to simplify life for the game developers. And the DePIN stuff we're talking about, like this does not add new complexity to the developer. Like, I mean, actually, there really won't be, for the people just using the SDK and don't want to think about that stuff, that's just what will happen automatically. It'll just find the place that meets your quality of service expectations, deploy it in the cloud, take it off your computer, ship it to the cloud, run it there, scale it up as needed, and then it just works. For people that want to like probe in and like see where servers are, that's fine. We'll provide tools to let you see what's going on too. For the people who are curious or want to like track latency every little step of the way, definitely a thing in game development. We'll offer that, but it comes down to simplicity and workflow, and that's something Beamable has always excelled at. And we don't want any of the, like when you hear a lot, I think when people haven't been in blockchain and they suddenly start hearing any of these terms, it's just like an overwhelming number of terms, and it's like proof of stake. What the heck is that? I eat steak, like it's delicious, but I don't know what a proof of stake is. Like, like so many of these terms come up, and then like they're overwhelmed, and something we want to be really thoughtful for, given that so much of our traffic is going to be generated from traditional game developers who are just building an MMO or a free-to-play mobile game. Like, it's got to all be accessible to them. Like, there should be basically zero vocabulary requirements around blockchain to take advantage of this. You should just have to be a game developer.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times the word soup can be such a scary, kind of intimidating factor for people. I think that you're taking the right approach by using the benefits and abstracting away a lot of the nomenclature, the terminology, and whatnot. I feel like we've covered so much about what you're talking about, building, where you've been at, kind of where you're going. But before we sort of wrap things up, I do have one final question that's not super deep and related, but as a long-term game developer yourself and as sort of an enabler for both Web 2 and Web 3 games, what are your opinions on kind of Web 3 games, the viability, the success? Like if you're to make a stock pick for people that are interested, because you hear about it a lot, it's a big topic. It was pretty trendy over the last couple of years. But what are your thoughts on that space? Is viable, a flash in the pan, elements of it that are exciting? What's your expert opinion here?
So we've always had a version of quote unquote Web3 games, but let's forget about the term Web3 games. I actually like to think of them in terms of open economy games. And by open economy games, I just mean a game where some of the objects in the game experience can be freely exchanged between the players. So if we go back to Dungeons and Dragons, your character sheet is an example of that. So you could take your character sheet to anywhere. You could play in a different campaign with a different DM if you wanted to. The miniatures that you paint could be brought into different campaigns. Magic the Gathering is a game that really took that idea and built on it, as well as Pokemon. So the whole idea being that you've got a set of collectible objects, the individual cards, the game is built around deck construction, and it was always inherent in the design of the game that people would be trading with each other. It's a collectible trading card game. With free-to-play games and online games, for the most part, that all changed, where games kind of created economies where they're the monopoly supplier, they're the central bank, they're the everything, but for good reasons, which is it's really hard to design economies that work well unless you control all the aspects of it. And it became a profitable business model that took a while for people to figure out. By the way, the initial use of free to play, which is where a lot of innovation in item-based economies, albeit non-exchangeable economies, non-open economies, happen, was just a response to it. Kind of came up largely in China, where there was a lot of piracy. So how can you take the problem of software piracy out of the equation, link it to servers, make it so that the transactions happen in the cloud on servers, as opposed to people just copying software between each other? And that was a business model reaction to the reality of just the ecosystem there. But then it didn't go really big and global until quite a few years went into figuring out how does that kind of economy and how does that business model actually change the kind of games that you make. So your question was, what's my thought on Web3 and where we're going? I believe that open economies are a really interesting way to design games. I don't think we've discovered the designs that completely work behind open trading economies yet, other than the obvious examples like Pokemon and Magic the Gathering, which were very successful in utilizing that model and bringing really, really big products to market. So here's the reality. Every business model changes the game design in important ways. I think phase one of Web3 was basically taking free-to-play games and strapping on Web3 open trading on top of it. And I don't know, that might work sometimes, but for the most part, that probably creates more problems than it solves in the gameplay experience in a lot of cases. It's actually the game that needs to change, not just swapping out the way people pay for content in the game and simply adding free trading. It's rethinking the game from the ground up. How does the whole experience change around the fact that it's like this? Just like in Magic the Gathering, it became a deck building game, and deck building was the thing that was exciting about it because you could trade. You could say, if we want to use Web3 games, the first composable game, like the deck was a composable NFT from all these other sub NFTs that you could exchange with people. And then the game experience revolved around that. And people composed different forms of game experience around it too, where they invented whole new formats of play. So not only are you doing one-on-one duels, people invented team games and different kind of tournament structures. That to me is sort of the most exciting aspect of Web3, which is not only how it's going to change game design, but how it evolves the meta experience of games so that players and communities start owning more of like play formats and community elements and tournaments and all the stuff that you can actually build around games. And I think we're just in the earliest stages of figuring out how people will experiment with that. So overall, bullish, but it takes time to do stuff in games, man. It's, I would say, like, be patient and let game designers figure it out. Let them take some risks. And I mean, the game developers are amongst the most creative people in the world. So there's going to be some really interesting things that come out of this. And I'm fortunate to say that at Beamable, we work with some of them. I mean, Mystery Society, Wildcard Alliance, Pog Digital, Mythical Games. I'm sorry for all the people that I won't even be able to list every single one, but like we've got a lot of really great game developers on our platform.
Yeah, no, and as a person that I'm really excited about DePIN, very clearly, obviously, but just the general adoption of Web3, it's great to hear that there is a there, if you will, for this, the intersection of the technology and sort of rethinking how developers and creators bridge that with what they're doing. So it'll be great to see how that sort of progresses over time, and we'll keep a close watchful eye, if you will. But God, we've covered so many different topics, Jon, between just all the challenges with what it looks like to build a game, from being able to create it, build it, deploy it, keep the sustainability, and what you're doing with taking those potential risks and kind of concerns and layering in the DePIN value prop, I think is super, super smart. It's very interesting, and I'm incredibly excited to see how you progress over time. But was there anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap it up? I know we covered so many things, but was there anything that we missed that you think we need to cover for people that might be interesting or useful for their learning?
We've covered so much. I would just say game designers are so creative. Hey, this weekend, try a new game category you've never tried before. You might discover something super fun. Like I think gaming is the media category of our time. And it synthesizes so much. You kind of have to be a Da Vinci to create it because there's like the scientific and artistic element all fused together. And it is the most important media category and the most important art form of our time. So it's something that has to be democratized and made a lot more stable for developers. And that's what our mission is at Beamable.
I love it. Well, go try a new game this weekend. I'm going to take up that offer. I will put Call of Duty down and try something new. I think that's a great call to action for folks.
Call of Duty's great, but that's also a great one to put down and try something new because they won.
Yep, it's very clear. Well, gosh, Jon, we really appreciate you coming on. I find this conversation to be so interesting because it's another one of these really unique problems that exist in the world that people, they love all the benefits of games. They don't even know these things exist. And you're using this new model called DePIN that we're all excited about to be able to continue adding value there and additionally solve problems. So I will link all of your social handles, the Twitter, the Substack, for people to go and find you. But we wanted to thank you again for coming on, Jon, and we'll wrap it up here for everybody tuning in. We wanted to thank you for listening. Be sure to go follow Jon. He's got some great takes, and this is definitely a project that you're going to want to follow for those that are both in the game development space and DePIN as well. So thank you so much, and we'll see everybody on the next one. Take care.